welcome to the Polsocpodcast Screencast.
Well done, Oisin. Thank you very much for your help.
Is that all?
That's it. Off you go now. Bye.
Okay, so welcome to the first episode of the Polsocpodcast Screencast, which is getting increasingly more difficult to say. Unfortunately, I have plenty of time to make this because I'm at home trying to keep my own kids from killing each other and trying to provide good content for the Polsoc students out there. So if you haven't already, you might think about subscribing to the website so you get all the updates of when new material is posted. I put lots of stuff up there in the last few days, and if you're scrolling through social media, you could do worse than click along and subscribe to KH Polsoc at KH Polsoc on Twitter to have a look at all the kind of sample articles that have been put up there over the last while, and for keeping up to date with general Polsoc stuff. So the goal of today's brief screencast is to think about some of the common mistakes that people are making as they're preparing to write the final drafts of their Citizenship Project report booklets, and also to think about the planning and writing up specifically of the Section A of that process. So the information we'll be looking at today is drawn, if you look on the bottom right of the screen here, if you clicked on Citizenship Projects, the documents that I'm digging into are all available there, including a checklist to make sure you're doing everything right at every stage as you go along. So we'll dive in. Now, I'm currently on my fourth class going through the Leave Insert process. So I've had a look at a lot of citizenship projects over the last 2.5 years, including some from other schools that I've had occasion to look at in the last while. And there seems to be a kind of set of general overall mistakes that people are making that are pretty common, and that shouldn't be too difficult for you to pick up on yourself when you're at home. The basic idea here is that most people, the big mistake in the writing up is that they're putting down the correct information in the wrong place. So you have to look through the requirements of the booklet very, very carefully. I'll talk about the Bible about this in a second, but we'll deal with the other elements of the plan here. The first one here is that most writing tends to be too generic. It seems like, what does generic mean? First of all, it means that anybody could have written it. Any Polsoc student anywhere in the country, no matter what their specific topic or their specific action that they've designed around that topic, no matter what they've done, they're writing about it as if anybody could have done it. This is your project, and you have to write it in a way that shows you what's going on, shows the examiner what's going on, even more importantly. The second thing is, and this is probably the biggest area where people lose big chunks of marks, people tend to conflate or to think that their research is the same as their action. Now, all of the project titles, as I'll go through in a second, have an element where you have to do some background reading and background research, and then they have an element that you have to do something, the action. The action is what you focus on in Section B, and we'll be dealing with that in detail in the next screencast, but most people need to focus on their research for this Section A. So the next part then is outline how you'll be going about doing your research and indicate the key research findings. This is one of the bullet points that we'll see in the Bible shortly, but it's basically, how am I going to find out what I'm going to find out, and what are the most important things? Now, you've got very little space to write a lot of this stuff up, so it's going to be really important that your key research findings are basically your headlines, the 3 or 4 most important things that you saw when you were doing your research, because they are going to help you to have a sense of flow, that your research is leading to something else. The mechanics of completing the bibliography are tricky and annoying, and you just have to do it right. And I will also be suggesting that when you're doing this, you put subheadings in your bibliography to show the examiner that you've looked at different elements of your project in detail. And probably the most important part of the entire Section A is to make sure that what your research is informs your action that comes after. In other words, you will need a sentence that sounds something like, having researched this topic, having discovered the main research findings, it suggested to me that I should do X, Y, Z. So what do I actually mean when I say that people are confusing the action with the research? Basically, the background reading that you do should help to make the decision as to what you're going to specifically do. So let's go through the 4 different titles, identify the one you're talking about, the one you're writing up, and see how it relates to you. So let's have a look at the first one. In the first one, our research element, this is our research fella here, our research is linked to researching the minority group in Ireland. But you have to use that information to create an exhibition or a display. So creating the exhibition is the action that you'll be writing about in part B. The research is what will be helping you to write that when you get to it. In the second title, your action isn't the investigation of whether social media threatens or supports contemporary democracy. The action is to organise the community-based action. And that's what you'll be writing about in part B. In the third one, it isn't doing the audit. That sounds like it's an action, but I don't think it's what they really mean. The action is the drafting the set of proposals that you will submit to your board of management. Now, this has been quite an unpopular topic. I have only a handful of students that have looked at this one, but nonetheless, it's the drafting of the proposals is what you're doing, not the actual audit, even though I think the two of those are quite poorly worded in the way they've done it in the SEC. Now, the final one there, examining and evaluating 3 different actions. Bear in mind that your research here should be on the actions, not the activists themselves. So it's what the young people are doing, not the young people themselves. And all your research then has to you have to deliver a presentation. So that's, you have to stand up in front of a group of people, deliver a presentation, but the goal of the presentation isn't to say, here's what I found out. The goal of the presentation is to engage people in climate discussion. So it needs to be a bit provocative. You need to build into that process somewhere where you're showing to the examiner, hey, look at me, I am actually going out there and I'm trying to get people talking about this. What they come up with is not your responsibility, although you might want to guide it in certain ways. You want to mediate the discussion, but it's the discussion which is the thing you're trying to generate. So hopefully that's a little bit clearer. So I call this section the Bible. It's on page 3 of the report booklet, and this is the thing that you go back to every time you're trying to work out what you should be saying in the different sections. So as you'll see here, each of these elements, if I just pop on my little pointer, each of these elements, it comes in little bullet points, but there are subheadings within these. Now, when you're laying out your section A, and you'll see this shortly, each one of these bullet points should be an underlined subheading to make it easy for the examiner to see where to give you marks. The worst thing in the world when you're correcting a topic like this is to see someone putting really good information that isn't in the right area, so it's causing the examiner hassle, and you never want to cause the examiner hassle. Always make it easy for them. Okay, so what does rationale mean? Explain the rationale for the action you've chosen to carry out. Now, this can be a bit fluffy because is this the topic or the specific action? My gut is that you should do both here. This topic appealed to me because I'm interested in whatever happens to be appropriate there, but the action that is coming up from that, you haven't really got to that yet. It's kind of strangely laid out that the action is being generated down here in the third part and being discussed in part B. So I think you should be trying to define the specific why you're interested in this topic and then the sub area of the topic that you're focusing in on. The second part of this is the give a clear account of the aims of your citizenship project. In other words, what are you hoping to do? What are you hoping to achieve with this project? And then the second part, the means you've chosen to achieve them. The means, it is basically how will you do that? I hope to do this. To do that, I will take action X, Y, and Z. So these are two things that are very, very closely linked, and you need to deal with both of those in this section. In the case of a group project, most of my students are doing individual projects actually, but with a group project, you have to say, I'll be focusing on some of the planning, the invitations, I'll be focusing on putting together the presentation, my friend will book the class, book the room, organise the meeting room, whatever it happens to be. So you have to say I and we as is appropriate. The third part then is the summary of the research undertaken. Now, there's 2 parts to this, the summary of the research undertaken and the key research finding. The summary of the research undertaken is, here is how I found out what I found out. In other words, I tried to get a very broad range of written sources from NGOs, reports from NGOs, reports from the government, sources in the media. I gathered some of my own information. I gathered some of my own data. And then the key research findings. Your research findings are, when I did all the things I just described, the most important things that I saw were, and then maybe 2 or 3 specific ideas. And then this is the key element of the whole project. This word here, I think, informed. Having found these things out, it was obvious to me that I should, and you fill in as is appropriate there. So, commenting on the sources of information used and the to inform the actions, such as web-based materials. So, if they're asking you about web-based materials, literature, interviews, and other sources, you should be trying to touch on at least 3 or 4, at least 3 of those 4 different areas. In other words, if they're looking for those different types of materials, make sure you've gone and looked for them. I'll do a separate little talk at the end then on the references and bibliography, because that's very mechanical, very easy to do, and it's just a matter of laying stuff out properly. But we'll get to that. So, the document we're about to interrogate is one of my students from last year who very kindly allowed me to circulate an anonymized version of their project. So I have permission to do all this. There's no worries about that. And if you go down to the bottom of the Citizenship Project tab on the Polsocpodcast website, scroll all the way down to the bottom, you'll get these 3 things. Now, I'll come back and talk about the checklist in a second, but at the moment we're going to stick with section A annotated. That's just one page that we'll copy. I've chopped it up into a few different sections to make it easier for us to digest and talk about. So, sorry about the quality of the type here. When I zoom it up, it looks a little bit blurry. So this student, as we'll see up in the top here, this student was writing about the denial of a human right, and she chose the human right of education, and we'll see why in a second. So what do I like about this? First of all, this was underlined here in the text, the rationale. She is very clearly labelled to the examiner, this is where I'm talking about the reason I chose it. And what I particularly liked about this is it's a very personal motivation. My personal experiences, such as my cousin being denied an education due to her disability, it turns out she's autistic, and we'll find that out later, and my volunteer work in the autism unit in my local primary school, and the key thinkers played a role in my decision to focus my project on the denial of education. So she lays out a kind of personal reason, she lays out a curricular reason, and she lays out a kind of a broader activity. She has done something that has made her pick this. Then what she very cleverly does, this student, she refines it down. She says, I'm going to look at this article of the UN UDHR, and I'm going to link it to some of my key thinkers. Now, some of these key thinkers we could think about including later on in section C when it talks about learning from the course, as you see there in the bullet points below, but it's fine to put it in here so long as you have done everything else. And she's very cleverly kind of said, look, here's the book that Kathleen Lynch wrote that she dipped into. Now, I don't think she read all of the book, but she certainly had a look at it, took it off my shelf a few times. And she talks about some of the observation in 12 schools that they undertook. So she knows she's not doing a massive amount of work, background research, but she's going to the right areas, which is all important. So what do I like about this? I like the headings. I like that it's personal. It doesn't feel generic. It doesn't feel like anybody off the street could have written this. And it also, we can see that she is touching it off different aspects of the course. Lots of different key concepts from politics and society are referenced here, which is great. Okay, now this is her aims. What am I going to do and how I'm going to do it? Now this is very logically laid out, and I think it's worthwhile popping through this. So obviously, first of all, we have our heading. Now I would want it underlined, but that's just to make it easier for everybody else. And she says the aims of my project were to raise awareness of the issues regarding access to education for children with special needs. This is a very straightforward, to the point, factual sentence. And what I really like about it is that she's not getting wrapped up in 15 different things. It's just, this is what I'm going to do, clear as day. You don't need to be writing in a very fancy style. The more direct, the better. And then carrying on from there, to obtain the views of people with disabilities and also people working with special needs education. Now, this ends up getting 12 out of 12. And now this is a problem. This isn't a sentence, but you're not, so long as it's understandable, the examiners aren't going to be trying to punish you for little grammar mistakes. So we can look past some of this stuff. Another aim was to write a letter to Amnesty International. So this is the specific requirements of the project, that she has to submit her findings, as you'll see on the title on the previous slide, to the human rights. So she's picked Amnesty International for a very specific reason, and what she wants the outcome to be: more funding to reduce class sizes, provide more training for teachers, and ensure all children in Ireland can access adequate school transport. So she's identified a number of specific areas that she wants to focus in on. Now, we said it's what I'm going to do, and here's how I do it. The here's how I do it, this is again linking directly back to the terms of the question, the terms of the title in the spec. The means I chose to achieve these aims. Now, every single one of you out there could have that sentence somewhere in their aims. I think it's very well balanced. It's half, 5 or 6 lines there for the aims, and then the means to achieve those aims is the second half. She's going to do her own questionnaire. In other words, she's going to gather her own data. She's going to have opportunities to facing people with disabilities, to dig into those things, and then is also going to email a questionnaire to some of the NGOs involved, Inclusion Ireland, Input Ireland, and Autism Ireland. So she's clearly going straight to the source. So she's clearly identified the right people to be talking to. So she says, I undertook qualitative interviews with a teacher who works in a special unit, and what I like about this is not only would this help her understanding of what's going on, but she's engaging with data terminology, which shows, yes, she understands that she's not trying to gather huge amounts of numbers as she would in her questionnaire, which is quantitative. The qualitative is getting a feel, getting a flavour for the things that can't be measured in numbers. My action plan was to collect all relevant data, review it, summarise the key findings, and communicate this to Amnesty International. So she's laid out exactly how she's going to go about doing those things. So her research undertaken, then, this is onto the next subheading, obviously, but it's just fitted into the page here the way I've chopped it up. For my sources, I identified specific reports on autism and education in Ireland, which help support my research findings. I reviewed websites and recent press coverage on the issue. I purposely reviewed a broad range of material so that I could collect valid data. So she has laid it out. Now, in the research undertaken, I could probably imagine people putting in the short names of specific reports that they had to look at, or specific government bodies that they dealt with. But nonetheless, that's fine the way she's phrased it. It's not too complicated. And I would probably consider putting in brackets here, see bibliography, so that you're suggesting to the examiner that you've laid out this detail in much broader depth later on in your project report booklet. So then we get to the research findings. Here she is very, very clever in what she does. First of all, it's good practice, it's good research, but she's looking here, look at the different things she's talking about. She has a she has a CSO report, she has her own questionnaires, she has key data associated with those things. She talks about the OECD report and the NDA's report. Okay, so she has clearly given different research findings from different reports. That shows that she's drawing in information from lots of different areas. The questionnaires further raised the issue that there was a lack of suitable transport. Now, this might not have been something that popped up in the CSO report about, or the OECD report about autism in schools, but it's clearly something that turned out to be quite important. Allocating more funds. So she then says, oh, and here's the conclusion that I have come to on this. My research indicates that the cost of not doing this not only affects the individual but society as a whole. And again, there's a little typo here, but we're not going to get too worried about that, as they become dependent on school welfare systems due to the lack of employment opportunities. So what this really indicates is that the student has brought in multiple different sources and has synthesized or brought them together in her head and said, here's the most important things I found out from these different sources. And she motivates that very, very clearly in her own experience. Now, if you look down to the side here, this section is out of 35, these 4 marks here: 7 out of 7, 12 out of 12, 12 out of 12, and 4 out of 4. I don't have a picture of her bibliography, but she got 4 out of 4 for that. And she actually ended up relating to 11 research items that she talked about, some from the media, some web-based, as we talked about a minute ago. So it's a very succinct writing up of her key research findings. The titles this year are slightly different, and I would want in here, I would want a sentence that sounds something like, having found out this important information, it has suggested to me that I should focus my action in a certain area. Now, her action was to make a submission, which was basically drafting a letter, which isn't what most of you will be doing this year, but nonetheless, the idea that you're saying, I'm doing this because I looked at something else and because I found out all this information, is the key idea. You don't want to just magically come up with an action in section B that doesn't obviously have a link to what you've just done. That feels very weak when you read it, and it feels very disconnected, which you want to avoid at all costs. So what we do now, don't forget to download and complete your checklist. As I said earlier on, at the bottom of the web page here, there's a project final checklist which basically says you you can go through the different aspects of the course and the booklet. I put little boxes for you to fill in as you go along. And the one thing that I would very strongly suggest is, if you're stuck at home and you're drafting your project, or even if you're watching this after COVID-19 has passed, when you've done that, send it to a friend. Don't rely on your teacher completely. Send it to your friend, and what you'll see when you send it to your friend and when they send theirs to you, it's much easier to spot a mistake in the work of somebody else than yourself. And when you spot a mistake in somebody else's work, you go, ooh, hang on, is that a mistake I've made myself? And you come back to your own work with a fresh set of eyes. It's also important, and this isn't just to be manipulative, but it's also important because then you get to write about peer review in your section C. But we'll get to that. And so don't forget then to subscribe to the podcast if you can, and have a look at all the research and all the resource material that's up there. There's about 35 or 40 different notes sets up there, and there's also obviously the 8 or 9 episodes of the podcast, and we'll be adding to them as we go. So best of luck with your project and getting it submitted on time. And even if you're stuck in a room isolated because of COVID-19, remember, you're not apart from society, you're a part of society. See you next time.